Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the event China as a Rising Power in Eastern Europe, Danger of its Economic Incentives, which is organized by the European Value Center of yeah. So sorry about that. Welcome to our event where we'll be discussing China as a rising power in Eastern Europe, danger of its economic incentives, organized by European Value Center for Security Policy and the Ukrainian organization text.org.ua. This event is funded by the European Union via the project Black Sea Trust for Regional Cooperation. My name is Matěj Šimalčík. I'm a director of the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, and I will be moderating today's highly timely event with fellow panelists who are highly accomplished experts on the topic. Today we have with us Mr. Jakub Jakóbowski, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies from Poland. Welcome, Jakub. We have Ms. Tinatin Khidasheli from Civic IDEA, and who's also a former Minister of Defense of Georgia. Welcome. We also have with us Ms. Alexandra Czekanowska, Head of Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, and Mr. Jan Pamphlet from European Values Center for Security Policy. Welcome. And last but not least, there's also with us Mr. Lukáš Sarek, who's an independent China analyst focused on China, Europe, and China-CEE relations and an economist. As the title suggests, today we're going to be discussing the economic presence of China in Eastern and Central Europe, which is a topic that's increasingly under scrutiny in our part of the world. We've seen several very timely reports coming out of numerous analysts around the region discussing the issue of Chinese crisis capital, Chinese loans, Chinese infrastructure projects, etc., and what they mean for this good governance in Central and Eastern European countries and overall good governance and economic health of the recipient countries. As for myself, as I'm mostly dealing with Slovakia and Czech Republic, we've seen a lot of developments in the past few months and the years where we've seen that China has been increasingly using various pre-existing domestic oligarchic and kleptocratic networks to inject coercive capital. In the target countries, it's been investing in various strategic industry, in energy, telecom sectors, banking, and so forth. And of course, it has been using its capital also to create ties to local elites and using which result in let's say some form of elite capture, and by which China has been able to exert a lot of influence over domestic and foreign politics of the target countries. But I don't want to talk about this problem myself because we have a lot of very good experts on the topic on the panel. So before we jump into targeted questions, I will like to give them all a little bit of a time and floor to tell us what they find as important in this topic. But before they start, also, I would like to remind you, our audience, that you can also pose questions to them by commenting in the live stream, and I will be sure to ask them what you find interesting in this. But before we jump to the questions, I would like to start with Mr. Jakub Jakóbowski to offer his introductory remarks on this topic.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and especially happy that we have both experts from what's usually defined as Central Eastern Europe, which is the 16+1/17+1 format countries, and the so-called Eastern Europe proper, let's say, with countries that are outside of this format. It's great to have both of those perspectives in one place. It's really rare to have those kinds of conversations. So happy to be here in the first place. And as I'm the first speaker here, I'd like to offer you with a general overview. I happen to cover in my papers, in my analysis, both let's say the 16+1 format countries, that is mostly EU countries plus Balkans, but also we as OSW cover China's presence in we did papers on China's presence in Belarus and Ukraine and Russia. So I'm happy to have both of these perspectives. And a very general overview of my thinking about China's influence that it gains through economic means, with the general assumption and observation that basically the horse that pulls the carriage of China's influence are Chinese loans and sometimes strategic investments, state-backed strategic investments. This is a thing that's true for most of the developing world. And by the way, China considers our region as a part of the developing world, while devising their own policies there, which is a root of many problems that China had in this region, by the way. But anyways, this is true for many countries around the world, with China approaching those countries with their quite specific offer of developmental loans, and also investments, sometimes in resources, sometimes in critical infrastructure. And looking at this very broad region that we cover today, I think there's one very big divide within this region. And this is, of course, related with the membership in the European Union in two respects. First of all, being a member of the European Union brings some considerable degree of resilience that comes with transparency, the laws that allow different stakeholders to get insights on what China is doing, but also laws that govern how the money is spent, the public procurement, and so on. So this is not always true. As we all know, in Hungary, the project done with China is classified for 10 years, so we don't have it everywhere. But I think the general rule of the thumb is that within the EU, you have a certain level of resilience that is also supported with the involvement of European Commission. The other major difference that the EU makes is the actual attractiveness of Chinese money. If you look at the financial offer, developmental offer, the way the EU finances connectivity and infrastructure, you will see that for most of the EU countries, when they have access to both Chinese money and European funds, they usually choose, or basically every time use, European funds. There are exceptions, of course, once again pointed at Hungary here, but I believe it's more of a political decision to use Chinese money rather than an economic decision there. So when we are talking about economic incentives, I think there's it's not that pronounced within the European Union. That may change someday when if this region loses the access to the European funds, but it's certainly not true today. And then we have the other side of the equation, those non-European countries within the region. I think, generally speaking, both the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership countries, that is Eastern Europe and Caucasus, fall in this broad category when the access to international financing is very limited, and where various internal constraints related to budget discipline and capacity of attracting those foreign funds make Chinese money attractive. And to be clear here, it's not that China is approaching the region as a almighty hegemon that sees a gap that it immediately feels, and this is automatically a leverage that they have over local politics and so on. It doesn't happen like that. There you need two to dance tango, as we say in Polish, and it's present in other languages, but the point is that you always have local elites that serve as gatekeepers for Chinese money, and oftentimes they're quite instrumentally use Chinese money and China as such to play their own games, a bit internal games within those countries or external games with the EU or with the US. And generally speaking, we can see a lot of projects that are discussed very widely because local elites want them to be discussed in order to, create the sense of China's entering the region and providing alternative. Whereas in reality, they're not progressing that much. And I think that's generally true for most of EU member states out of this broader region. Even in Hungary, even in a country that is, the most advanced in terms of dealing with China, you don't really see these things happening. We talk about them for years, but they're not that much present. But then on the other hand, you have cases of countries mostly outside of the EU, and I would say Belarus and Serbia are the best examples of China really advancing and having a real economic impact. Of course, in partnership with local elites, and Lukashenko in Belarus, and Prime Minister Vučić on the other hand. But in those cases, the willingness to dance politically was followed by considerable money inflow that gives China some leverage over these countries. Whether or not they will use it, this is another question, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss it throughout the discussion. I spent my 7 minutes, so I'll leave the floor to others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakub, for your introduction, and I think you provided quite a concise overview of what is the issue with Chinese financing within the EU, and that I like your point that you offered that within EU with a strong governance regime we actually have a lot of resilience that can help us tackle the problem. Nevertheless, we have also representatives here from non-EU countries, and I would like to move towards Ms. Tinatin Khidasheli to maybe to run us through the situation in Georgia and how Georgia is dealing with the issue of Chinese financial presence, and actually to what extent is China present in your country. Ms. Khidasheli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for this wonderful e-conference and opportunity to speak with distinguished colleagues. I completely agree. Jakub kind of gave us a framework and lots of very important points to be addressed. And answering your question, I will exactly start from the points that Jakub raised about the two main directions China moves economically in countries of interest, for them being those loans and strategic investments, right? This is how normally we see China coming to those states. Georgia somehow represents a little bit an original case in this extent, because we do not really have that much of a loan. It's under 150 million US dollars, which is like less than probably any other loan we have to international financial institutions or individual countries, being it European Union or others. And we do not actually have that much of a strategic investment from China. But we still talk about China in Georgia. We still talk about increasing influence and about the dominance to a certain level that you can see year by year more and more. What we have is an interesting case of, and I believe Georgia is not the only country like that, but we witness it most vividly, is the Georgia being almost completely dependent on strategic works, in terms of strategic works on Chinese companies. Every single procurement that is announced by the state, out of the state budget or out of the money coming from the European Union or other international organizations or financial institutions, is won by Chinese companies, is won in a very unfair bids and with lots of privileges to those Chinese companies. Another pattern that we see here as we go from one company to another is that all of them, like literally speaking, all of them are the companies who've been discredited already in many countries, who've been blacklisted by lots of IFIs, being it World Bank or Asia Development Bank or Africa Development Bank, or you name it. But they still managed to end up in Georgia, being involved in dozens of billion-dollar worth projects, being it roads, or other strategically important cases that we witness here. It is to the extent that probably for the first time we've seen kind of diplomatic démarches from the several EU ambassadors here, basically asking questions why it is happening, why European Union member states companies are almost always disqualified from those bids, and Chinese are almost always getting being the winners in that. The very last statements we've seen from the Polish ambassador, who was very critical and very outspoken about this issue. Well, there are several reasons for that. China works in Georgia in a very traditional way, like they did in Czech Republic or in every other country they've entered, being in very close relation with the ruling elite, employing former high officials in their companies. Actually, for the first time in the history of independent Georgia, we have our country run today by officially Chinese men. The prime minister that we have now was working for very infamous CFC company that I'm sure you are all aware of for a number of months after he resigned, first time being prime minister after he resigned from his post. And it was actually after the company was already on trial in several countries, including in the United States, for lots of criminal charges. We see this every day. We see direct lobbying of various Chinese companies entering different sectors, and the very last one we had for the first time, actually, them entering the Georgia's defense and security sector when the Georgia Ministry of Defense started cooperation with actually Ukrainian Chinese sort of mixed Ukrainian Chinese company on several defense capability issues. And again, once again, the company being extremely discredited and actually blacklisted by President Zelensky and by the US Department of Commerce. But again, it never prevented the Georgian government to have them contracted and have all kinds of deals with them. Actually, it was very tragic and funny at the same time story that the announcement came on Georgian media exactly the same day, exactly literally speaking the same day, 30th of January of this year, when President Zelensky blacklisted the company, issued the decree about blacklisting the company. Like in the morning, we had the news that Georgian defense sector cut a deal with this Chinese company, and then in the afternoon there was the news that President Zelensky blacklisted the company, and that was kind of a symbolic for many reasons. Another issue I wanted to address, listening to Jakub, is the issue of the loans as such, generally speaking, that the financial resources not being available for Eastern countries as much as for the members of the European Union. Actually, in case of Georgia, it is not necessarily true. We never had that kind of a problem. For whatever reason, we were always privileged of having European or American or other Western money, being those grants or loans or investments available for Georgia if there was a political will and if there were projects available in country for those purposes. But it is a political choice, and I completely agree with you on that. And we are right now in a process of a big political fight in a country, as my government refused the extremely favorable loan from the European Union that was already agreed last year, and we actually got the first tranche last year, and we were supposed to get the second one this year, and we refused it. We said no to, once again, to outline, except for it being the money from the European Union. Also, it was the most favorable loan we ever had from any other institution. But at the same time, we do not have problem accepting the loans from AIIB, which, as you know, is the Chinese financial institution, on a completely different grounds and with completely different conditions, not even comparable to the European Union. And it is In our case, if in other cases we just say it's political, and sometimes it's even difficult to prove, in our case it's very much transparently political decision, and the message by the Georgian government to the rest of the world where the country is going to and what direction we are taking when it comes to choosing partners and allies and choosing those we wanna work in this world together. And to finish here, it's a very long story, but to cut it short, just as an example of the culture that Chinese money brings to my country, I would mention the same infamous CFC's case because it became an example of everything, example of illegality, example of corruption, example of Georgian political elite being directly connected to the benefits brought by that contract, and at the end of the day, after the bankruptcy of the company itself, using it for its own advantage in determining the strategic choices for the country. Again, it's a very long story. I wrote about it intensively, and later on during the discussion, if the issue of the corruption will emerge, I'll try to tell a little bit more about it, because I think that it was a very interesting case for not only for Georgia but also for all countries involved in those kinds of scandals to look after and learn the lessons from those stories. Thank you once again.
Thank you for your highly interesting input, and of course the theme of corruption, I think it will run through more than yours input, and I think we'll have to get back to it. But before we get to discussing specifics of these kind of cases, I would like to turn to Alexandra Tsekhanowska to give us an overview of what's going on in Ukraine and how to deal with the problem.
Hi, thank you for having me, and I'm very grateful to everyone who watches this conversation on a very important issue online, because to speak on a matter of such importance is of great pleasure, but also of great value to me as a representative of Ukraine, because Ukraine is somewhat in a special situation. We have quite a lot, unfortunately, experience of malign hybrid influence when it comes from Russia. And we have been dealing with Russian hybrid aggression for several years now. And on one hand, although at a great price, it gives us some very valuable insights into how hybrid aggression and hybrid influence may work. But on the other hand, it, for obviously natural reasons, but still, it makes us almost always exclusively focused on Russia. And so the potential threat behind Chinese hybrid influence often eludes us. I don't think that this is strategically correct. And while we do have to understand our current situation, and we do have to realize that the majority of external threats come from Russian Federation when it comes to Ukraine, we cannot completely forget about China, because in the long run, it may be a very big mistake. I would argue for a balanced approach when we distribute our attention between the key threats, let's say proportionally. And if we talk about the most crucial challenges regarding Chinese influence in Ukraine, they are, I think, quite similar to what my colleagues have already mentioned. So I'll try to avoid repetition. Forgive me if I cannot do it completely, but still. One of the things that I think we still haven't focused focused on is the influence of Confucius institutes, which in Ukraine is almost the exclusive place for anyone who is interested in learning Chinese language or learning more about Chinese culture and history to grant this knowledge. And we unfortunately know it is expert knowledge that Confucius Institutes is not neutral, it's extremely biased, and it basically serves as a platform not for soft power as it should be, but for propaganda. And in Ukraine, there are, to the best of my knowledge, 5 similar centers. And as I said, almost everyone who doesn't choose Chinese language, let's say, as their professional orientation and studied at university full-time, everyone else basically has no choice but to go to Confucius Institute and be exposed to the Chinese perception, to the Chinese state perception. But still, perhaps the most important challenge is linked to business and loans that we have already started to discuss here. We know that Beijing often uses its business initiatives to pave way for hybrid influence. And one of the ways is, of course, to weaponize corruption. For Ukraine, this issue has special importance and bears special risks because corruption has been repeatedly mentioned as perceived as one of the key threats by Ukrainian population. So Ukrainian population mostly thinks that there are 2 major threats to Ukrainian nation and to Ukrainian state, and this is war with Russian Federation and corruption. And should we imagine the possibility that corruption is weaponized and the problem grows even bigger due to the Chinese money, we can only imagine how much that would destabilize the internal situation, both politically and economically, and what kind of consequences it can have for our political stability. Considering that Ukrainian presidential office was recently considering not just investments, but also loans, for us, this is a risk that's quite present. And we could also fall into, potentially we could also fall into a what we can call a debt trap, which happened with several countries, and not just several African countries, but also states like Montenegro, for example. And it is often, these debt traps are often sold in the best interest of Beijing when China has at least temporarily control over strategic state resources. And it should be noted here that in July this year, Ukrainian Ministry of Infrastructure has signed a contract, signed a deal with China, which gives us an opportunity to receive Chinese loans, but we still do not know the terms of this deal, and it has not been made public. I think this is a source of great concern for us. We may also remember, and I will be very brief here, the situation with Motor Sich, an enterprise which produces engines for planes, for helicopters, and also for rockets, and over which Chinese investors repeatedly tried to seize control. And while the enterprise has been returned to state property, back in the time, the situation was a considerable blow to our relations with Western partners who were obviously very worried due to the potential security concerns. And we can understand them because China is known for being rather favorable, let's say, of industrial espionage. We may also finally say that the irresponsible claims which have been made by some of the top Ukrainian officials don't really help the situation that we are in. For example, David Arahamia, who is the leader of the faction of Servant of the People Party in our parliament, has claimed that Ukraine could turn east, and he meant China, if it has had a necessity to rebalance its position. If the Western partners somehow decided to to settle their relations with Russia at the expense of Ukraine's national interests. So, of course, we understand that Ukraine's national interests cannot be sacrificed, and they are not a subject of negotiation by other actors, with these negotiations don't include in us. But we also have to understand that actually turning east and turning to China is not a choice. It doesn't help our situation strategically, and it is not a solution. If we talk about solutions a little bit, and I need approximately 1 more minute of time, I would roughly outline just several claims, and I think we can have a chance to discuss it later. I think that we definitely need more independent knowledge on China, knowledge that isn't conveying the official perception of Beijing. We need more public debate like this one, because, for example, in Ukraine, this topic is almost exempt when it comes even to expert community. And of course, it creates the, as we said, lack of independent knowledge, which heavily influences our public officials as well. We, of course, need to look at this problem in the broader issue of countering corruption, because weaponizing corruption potentially is a very big threat for strategic stability of the country. And in general, we have to make emphasis on creating and enhancing national resilience without a focus on specific actor which might be a threat for us, and not becoming too dependent on a specific state that has, for example, malign intent towards us at the moment, but to enhance our resilience as a whole. That would protect us from a potential threat from basically any actor, a malign state or a malign third actor. It doesn't really make a difference. So I vote for resilience, and that's it with me.
Thank you. It's very interesting to contrast what's going on in Ukraine and how you perceive the situation vis-a-vis China, and compare it with Georgia, and compare with also European countries. And we will return back to the EU now. But before we move on, I would just like to remind our audience that they can pose questions to the panelists by commenting below the live stream, and I'll be sure to ask your questions after the initial remarks are over. But now we'll move back to the EU with Jan Pamphlet from European Value Center for Security Policy, who will outline the situation with regards to China in the Czech Republic, and he will also provide some insights into what kind of solutions we can adopt to deal with the problem. Jan, please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Matěj. Happy to join and share a few ideas, primarily stemming from the EVC report that is right now being finalized. In recent years, China has used many malign practices and tools of malign economic influence all around the world. Well, these range from covert funding, corrosive capital inflow, predatory acquisitions targeting technology, industrial espionage and IP thefts, harvesting personal data, to aggressive trade policy and death threat diplomacy. The Czech Republic has not avoided being the target of these malign economic practices either. We had many examples. I just mentioned a few. Overfunding by the Chinese embassy to companies organizing events in academia under the guise of university initiative. Covert funding to a PRC agency to improve the media image of the PRC in the Czech Republic through a seemingly independent expert outlet, whereby the funding came, in fact, from the largest Czech investing group making the big money in China, thanks to the will of the Communist Party. Establishing questionable corporate structures like the CEFC, in fact, CEFC Europe, headquartered in Prague, its chairman even became the economic advisor of the Czech president, and shortly after was arrested for corruption and sort of made disappear, probably to China, never reappeared. Extortion of the Czech Senate speaker over a planned visit to Taiwan with business delegation. He received a threatening letter specifically naming Czech companies operating in China that would be subject to retaliation. Nonetheless, According to Czech Investment Support State Agency, the Czech Invest, there was almost no noticeable impact of the Chinese counteraction. This is thanks to the relatively low dependence of the Czech Republic's economy on China. So it could be concluded that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has not that strong leverage overall over us, which brings me to the policy reaction. We interviewed quite a few people recently, Czech and international stakeholders with business background or with expertise in China's foreign policy and national security. These include private sector leaders, business association representatives, attorneys, government officials from the relevant ministries, and security experts. Based on these consultations with the experts and the outcomes, we completed a comprehensive set of essential countermeasures to be adopted by the Czech Republic or the Czech government or the relevant institutions in 7 policy areas, with measures to prevent corrosive capital's penetration of the economy, to respond to economic pressure and disruptive practices, to diversify supply chains and thus reduce dependence on China, to prevent illegal and illegitimate financial and non-financial flows, prevent corruption and human rights violations in the economic relations, to protect universities and research, and last but not least, to strengthen knowledge, understanding, and monitoring of China and its activities. From these broad areas of possible action and based on the consultations outcomes, we conclude that following responses should be prioritized. You should be able to see it on the screen. The priority measures focused on fine-tuning the Czech Republic's foreign investment screening mechanism, on protecting strategic and emerging disruptive and dual-use technologies, on protecting universities and research institutions, and finally, on the diversifying trade relations and concluding free trade agreements with like-minded partners. For example, enhancing economic cooperation with Taiwan, specifically by concluding the bilateral investment agreement was mentioned several times during the interviews that we had. Well, maybe it sounds too generic, but I encourage you to read our report once published and finalized. And I probably stop here and I'll be more specific later on.
Thank you, Jan, and I'm very happy that you started to incorporate this kind of solutions that we can discuss a little bit more later on. But we have one more speaker to provide his initial remarks, Mr. Lukáš Sarek. And I'm sure we've already heard quite a lot from the other panelists, which unfortunately leaves you with this unfortunate position of going last. But I'm pretty sure that you as an economist can provide us with a unique take on this problem. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here. Well, yes, there was a lot already told by other speakers, and what I could add, I think that what comes from our conversation is that the Chinese targets allies, and that the expression alliance capture is the one that explains, that describes the Chinese operations very well. I will be based on the example of Poland, but I think that some of the Polish experiences can be shared across the countries. There are 3 groups of the actors that are being targeted by the Chinese side in Poland. And there are politicians, business circles, and think tanks and researchers in academia. And the economic incentives vary depending on the group. Some of them are common for all the groups, some of them are only targeted at one group. So if we are talking about the economic incentives, first of all, I think that we should briefly go through the targets of the Chinese objectives, because there is no money for nothing. The Chinese give some economic offer, but they expect something in return. And I think that there are several areas that could be listed, like the recognition, but that is money targeting politicians and researchers, for example, the recognition of the One China, the recognition of the One China policy, keeping the relations with Taiwan low profile. And another area is to supporting Chinese policies and activities, or at least remaining silent on the human rights abuses in China and on the Chinese position on the human rights. And the third one is expressing and acknowledging the achievement, is expressing the expressing the admiration for the Chinese economic and economic achievements, and expressing the acknowledgement and understanding for the Chinese political and economic model. And this is targeting both to politicians and to researchers. There are also other areas like maintaining the open access for the Chinese goods and for the Chinese construction companies and other companies, including technology companies, to the markets, which is maybe not as important. It was like 2 or 3 years ago, but still is the component of the Chinese activities. And two other, like weakening the cooperation of the EU members, of the V4 countries and countries with the US administration, as well as influencing the governments, the politicians within the EU member countries, to support Chinese policies, or at least to facilitate Chinese activities within the European Union and on the European Union forums. And these are some objectives that Chinese want to achieve, and they want to pay for that. Or at least we already, some politicians or business circles or researchers hope that the Chinese will pay for that. And while the laws are some way, but they are, as Jakub said, this is important for the non-EU members. For EU members, the main carrot are not the laws, it's not the financing, not yet at least, but the everlasting promises of opening the huge and vast Chinese market. So financing definitely is not on the table for EU. And this is not the main carrot. Another is the foreign direct investment, the Chinese investments in EU. And this should be differentiated from the Chinese participation in infrastructural projects, which is much more related to the financing. As for the think tanks and researchers, the important is the financing of the cooperation between the universities, financing the researchers of the European researchers, Polish researchers within China, facilitating the joint projects. And for some universities in Poland, it is important, as already a similar situation with Ukraine, to supporting establishment and financing of the Confucius institutes. So there are different areas and different ways of economic incentives that the Chinese side would use to achieve their objectives. I think that there is also another area, which is the tools that Chinese use within the business circles, within the politician circles, and in academia. But I think that we could talk about it a little bit later in details. Thank you.
Thank you, Lukáš, and I'm very glad that we got this initial remarks in place because we've already heard quite a lot of takes on this, and I already see some patterns emerging about this kind of similarities and differences between the individual countries. So in the first round of questions, I would like to focus on this aspect: that what are the similar dynamics of the problem that we are facing with regards to China? What makes each country a little bit different? Are there any universal solutions we can adopt, and maybe as a first respondent to address this issue of similarity and difference, and maybe focusing also on the similarities and differences between EU and non-EU targets can be answered at first by Alexandra.
I beg your pardon? I have troubles with connection.
Oh, I'm sorry for that. I was wondering if you could maybe provide for us a little bit of feedback on what makes the situation with regards to China similar and different between EU targets and non-EU targets.
Well, I think we have out of what has been discussed here today, I think we can definitely outline several similarities. So first of all, it's the lack of independent knowledge, which I think is a joint problem for many countries. Also, in some states like Ukraine, for example, this may be a bigger problem than in others, where there is an alternative source of knowledge. There is a lack of substantial attention to the issue, which I think also unites a lot of states in both regions. There is also quite a similar approach that China takes when it comes to work with regional elites and using economic incentives such as loans and weaponizing corruption. So these are the joint things. But if I were to make my own personal conclusion when it comes to differences, I think that China, quite similar to Russia, aims to exploit the key vulnerabilities. And in countries that are suffering from corruption, for example, more than their counterparts, corruption is more likely to be exploited by the People's Republic of China. I hope you heard me because...
Yes, we heard you very well, Alexandra. So thank you, and I agree with you that this level of domestic corruption is a key difference, maybe between or generally the level of good governance reforms and their vulnerabilities are maybe a key difference between the EU and the non-EU states, and for us who are listening in from the EU member states, this may be a good reminder of the importance of EU as a guarantor of good governance and security. But I would like to also hear on this issue of similarities and differences, maybe a take from within the EU. So Jakub Jakóbowski, maybe if you could comment on this a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think generally we are entering a phase where an increased competition between China and the US, but hopefully China and the West in general is turning into the regional landscape in the situation when we'll encounter various forms of coercion towards countries in the region here. I think Jan has mentioned the case of China delivering a list of companies that it can retaliate against in connection with political developments. I think, like judging from the things we've been talking about up to this moment here, I would say there are two main venues on a way that China could influence our region economically. The first is the elite capture, the various forms of it, and I think it was covered very extensively. And as for the solution, I think all kinds related to being more resilient to it is a very general solution. But you have independent knowledge that was raised. You have all kinds of investigative journalism that needs to look at all the deals that are happening. You need to have deepened cooperation on discovering and targeting these kinds of influence on the level of both the EU and NATO for countries that are part of it, but also other frameworks, political frameworks that non-EU and non-NATO countries are present in. So there are a lot of institutional arrangements that can be used to make this whole thing more institutionalized. And this is about the elite capture, be it on the level of politics or business circles or academia and think tanks, and you name it. Other venues are present there too. But then there's the other aspect of potential economic influence that was just raised here, and I think there is a similarity among the region that there are some kinds of economic coercion that the region here is quite immune to, especially when compared to Germany, for example, or generally countries that are heavily invested inside China. I think Czech Republic is a special case because it's a country that really has global operating companies that are present in China, be it Škoda or late Petr Kellner's financial empire, and the leverage that China has over this market access that has already been consumed and it's already there. This is a common pattern of China threatening foreign investors inside China. Czech Republic is a special case, but I'd say generally speaking, when compared to Western Europe or US or Japan and other developed countries, we are quite immune to that because our stake inside China is very limited. Of course, it's a thing we should look at. There are specific cases of companies and countries that China has leverage over because of the investments inside China, but it's not that pronounced. What I'd like to raise is the other form of economic coercion linked to exports. And we've seen this happening in numerous cases. Australia is very instrumental here. Of course, it's in a very different regional world, but the instruments that China applied to coerce and punish Australia can be used basically anywhere. We are looking, we are seeing it to a certain degree, a small degree in case of Lithuania now when China is threatening specific Lithuanian companies exporting to China, especially in the foodstuff sector, lumbering sector, and so on. Lithuania is very special because it's also quite immune to this kind of threats. So about 1% of Lithuanian exports goes to China. But then there's, I think, in other countries are in quite a different situation. And if you look at Ukraine now, China is the primary export market for Ukrainian grain, and it is a leverage that China has over Ukraine. Of course, it's not that China can ban all kinds of exports just on a whim, because as we've seen in Australia, there are certain types of goods that China doesn't want to ban, even if it's conflicted with some country politically, like iron ores that China still needs from Australia, so it still imports that. There are limits to that. But I think what we should look at and kind of assess is this kind of export dependencies that China can use, because I would say that being in this region that is consistently threatened by Russia and seeing China being ever closer to Russia, I think we are on a collision course with China generally, that many countries in the region feel they lean towards the US because of security concerns. And then on the other hand, we have Russia and China that are even closer together. Once again, just finishing this run, once again pointing at Lithuania, where we've seen, I think, the first case of China openly asking Belarus and Russia to jointly punish Lithuania for what it did in a trilateral China, Russia, Belarus sanctions. It didn't take off for many reasons yet, but I think we should definitely look at and be prepared for in terms of the potential for economic cooperation from China. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub. Moving on from this issue of similarity and difference between the EU and non-EU targets, one of the key themes that I saw emerging from your initial discussion was the role of pre-existing domestic corruption as an enabling factor for increasing Chinese malign influence, including in these economic and creative capital issues. So in your opinion, is the issue of Chinese influence in Central and Eastern European countries inherently tied to domestic corruption, or is it more of an international issue? In other words, do we, in order to deal with this, do we just need to deal with corruption, or are there also other problems that we need to target besides corruption in order to safeguard against Chinese malign influence? Whoever wants to start, please feel free. But if there's no volunteer, I will call on you. So maybe we can start with Ms. Khidasheli, because I think this was quite a prominent feature in Georgia, according to your initial intervention.
Yeah, thank you once again. It is a big issue, and it is the major difference. We've talked about similarities before, but one of the major differences that we have, I always like to compare this example. When Georgia became independent country, one of the very first big investors who came to Georgia was the British Petroleum. When we started Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan pipeline, strategic pipeline project. And it belongs to the importance of the project itself and the whole security guarantees coming with the project for the country. One of the most important features that we had with BP coming to Georgia so massively was that it brought completely different culture, completely different business ethics, completely different culture in terms of dealing with the customers, dealing with the villages and villagers who supposedly suffered from the pipeline entering their backyards and their villages. Completely different culture in the courts when there were court cases against the BP. And I remember I was just a student, a law school student at that time, and for those years, a rare case of someone speaking English. So I had the privilege of working as an interpreter at that time with them, and we were all fascinated by once again, by the business ethics and generally by the ethics of BP compared to what we knew from the Soviet Union, what we knew about the role of a judge and the prosecutor and the tax inspector and the lawyer in court. And now, when you compare those examples that we've learned for these 30 years to the examples that we are seeing now mainly since 2015, when the Chinese companies started massively to enter Georgia, it's kind of back to USSR, sort of a story for us, in lots of very different directions in terms of the practices that they are bringing to the country, dealing with the local businesses, dealing with the customers. Somebody mentioned human rights violations. The problem is huge in Georgia in terms of the workers' rights who work in those Chinese companies on various projects. From the environmental point of view, for most of those projects, I mean, you name it, everywhere you touch, you have basically you have a disaster there. And then complete negligence on the side of the government, no due diligence, no understanding of the problem, no real representation of the state interests. It's as I've already said, kind of back to the USSR kind of a practice. I think what is very important and crucial here is that I've mentioned during my introductory speech that most of the projects that, for example, in my country, and I believe in most of my neighborhood, are implemented by Chinese, are funded by the European money, being it through European Union or EBRD or even the World Bank or other IFIs where the European Union countries are big contributors. And because the money is Western, I think that it should be pretty easy to put certain conditions on that money, conditions of in terms of the well, both anti-corruption measures as well as in terms of business ethics, how, who, under what circumstances gets the right to implement those projects. If a company is banned in, I don't know, UK or in France or in Czech Republic, then it should be made a conditionality for the EU money in my country as well. There should be no differences, whether they go to Poland or they go to Georgia, as long as the source of finances is the same. That will be one of the kind of leverages we can use when we deal with those kinds of projects. The other issue is that unfortunately we are pretty bad students, students of learning from the mistakes of others, right? If we really wanna do better, then there is a huge experience out there. And already several times mentioned CFC will be the best case for it, because if my government was ever interested, they could just go and check what was happening in Prague and in Czech Republic regarding the CFC, and would never deal with this company, right? But obviously nobody cared, or even worse, they knew and they did not care that the problem was so big. So that's this kind of due diligence request, and the action according to this due diligence should be another grounds for states to make compulsory by laws, by international requirements, standards, I don't know, the conditionalities when they deal with the Chinese companies. Something similar that we do with the Russian companies. And that will be my last point. I think that the biggest problem we have is that well, we have it with Russians as well. I don't want to be misunderstood that we do not complain about that part. We do complain about that part when it comes to, especially when it comes to some countries of the European Union, that we do not have a unified approach to the problems created by Moscow. But when it comes to Beijing, it's even bigger. It's still seen as kind of alternative balancing power to Moscow. And that's why some things are okay that won't be okay otherwise. So you don't want to depend on Russian markets. Here is alternative Chinese market. Let's diversify. And when you talk about diversification, well, China is the country that comes first on your mind, that you diversify there, without really understanding that you are not escaping the problem. You are just jumping into similar problem, but in another country. And here, unfortunately, we do not see this coherent approach from our partners. Of course, the job needs to be done by us, first of all. I'm not saying that someone else should be doing our job. But when it comes to general set of standards that we follow, in most of the cases, in case of Russia, I think that it is time when there should be something similar done in case of China as well. Unfortunately, this process of fascination, some kind of fascination with Chinese rapidly growing economy and China's success, and all those stories that we were reading 5-10 years ago, is still there in some countries, and particularly in new countries that China is entering. This fascination is not gone anywhere, and as long as it's there, and as long as we are charmed with all those successes, obviously it's very difficult to talk in the same terms as we talk about the Chinese disinformation, Russian disinformation campaigns, or Russian influence power, or the troubles created by the propaganda of the Kremlin machinery. Using the same terminology with China sometimes is not understood even seriously. People look at you like you are crazy, and unfortunately, it's not only because the domestic governments are playing its role in it, but it's also that the information flow that is coming from everywhere is not that much clear, is not that as clear and as definite as it is in Kremlin case when it comes to Beijing. And we need to be on the same page there, all of us, when talking about the problems created by either by particular single companies or by Confucius institutes that was mentioned here, or other academic programs that are in our countries. For example, in case of Georgia, I can easily tell you that when it comes to numbers, proportionally taken, if things continue the way they are right now, in 5 years' time, we will have more Chinese very high security risk university graduated Georgians than we have US or European university graduated Georgians, because of the number of scholarships and because of the number of privileges that they give to Georgian students. And it is dangerous because we know the ideology of most of those universities. And well, because of my age, I went in one of those in the Soviet Union. So we know how it works with the propaganda, Communist Party run systems. And unfortunately, this is the generation that is going to run the country in a pretty near future. And once again, they will be in dominance in bigger numbers than everybody else if things continue the way they are today.
Right. Thanks, Tinatin. And I find these entire dynamics, between domestic corruption, kleptocracy, bad, poor and good governance, and how China comes into that quite fascinating. But before we move on with my questions, and I still have plenty of those, we have our first question from the audience that I would like to pose to you. And this is actually a question for all the panelists. And the question is, to what extent would you say that the increase in Chinese influence is a reflection of disillusionment with Western partners in your countries, and what can the EU and other Western partners do to counter this development? Maybe we can start with Jan to start discussing this question.
I'm sorry, Matěj, I must ask you to repeat the question, please.
Yes, gladly. The question is, to what extent would you say that the increase in Chinese influence is a reflection of disillusionment with Western partners in your countries? And what can the EU and other Western partners do to counter this development? And I think for you, this is a very good question, because in Czech Republic, this is, I think, quite a discussion between two camps that have very distinct ideas about foreign policy.
Well, the issue of disillusion, right? Well, maybe this has something in common with the issue of the reputation whitewashing that I mentioned during my opening remarks, where the entities operating in China and depending on China's goodwill have a vested interest in doing doing what the CCP might like. So it pours money into activities that China like, which go into the direction of building a good image of China in the domestic economy, among the elites, and so on. This is why probably one of the biggest Czech companies, the biggest investment companies, made some covered investments in the PR agency, which then transferred funds to a media or seemingly expert independent outlet, which was not in fact independent, but was paid to do a very soft propaganda, or very in a very smart way. So this is maybe how the image of China is being whitewashed in the Czech Republic, using or with the help of some covered money. Was that a question? or Matěj, you are muted. Matěj, we cannot hear you.
Oh yes, after 1.5 years, still not accustomed to unmuting myself all the time. So yeah, Jan, thanks for this. But the question is, to what extent the disillusionment with West is a factor in enabling Chinese influence? So you can maybe comment on that directly, or anyone else, if you have any thoughts on this, please feel free to jump in, because this, as I said, this is a question posed to all the panelists.
Yeah, probably I'll pass the floor to someone else.
Yeah, I saw Tinatin raising hand.
Yeah, just a very quick reaction to it. I would say that it's yeah, maybe for some countries it is true, but I think that some of these, particularly Eastern countries, are playing a very dangerous game, and we've heard it from our Ukrainian speaker as well, that some of our governments are using, well, they think using China as a scary power for the West, as a balancing power for the West, sort of saying that, oh, you don't want us, we will move. We remember just recently Zelensky's statements, very, very dangerous, I would say, statements, when he was talking on the one hand about the concrete time frame to be given by the NATO and European Union to Ukraine, where I completely agree, we do need to be given those time frames, both of our countries, but at the same time talking about the China as a potential for bigger engagement and bigger investments and bigger opportunities for Ukraine. So he basically put those things on the same level, by that basically playing this game that, well, okay, it's the moment when we need to decide where we go. And as it was said, we go east or we go west. And if you don't let us in the west, then we do not really have a choice. I think it's a very, very dangerous and actually very childish game that our government, my government as well, obviously, are playing. And it's not necessarily because of the dissolution with the Western powers, but more kind of looking for an escape, for answers to their people, that to the requests and demands and needs of the people for more investments, more jobs that those investments are going to create. That, okay, now money is in China, so let's play the Chinese card. We will have more jobs in our countries, and it's a pretty dangerous scheme that we are getting in ourselves.
Thanks. I saw Luca raising hand as well, and you wanted to comment on this.
Very shortly, I think that I think that we have to some extent similar situation in V4 countries. Whenever the frictions with European Union are more pressuring the authorities, then more voices appear about the necessity of closer cooperation with China. And the government officials or party or some officials from the political parties highlight the opportunities of financing, of export to China, of extending the economic cooperation. So I think that I fully agree with what has been just said before, that it is a dangerous game. And the point is that one of the three groups that I mentioned as targeted by the Chinese side as a group of targeted for influence are politicians. And politicians in many countries, including Poland, I think, Hungary, has not learned yet that this Chinese carrot is not as sweet, as nice as it seems to be. And that is the problem. Because the business with China has not been good. Now, exports from V4 countries, which constitutes around 75% of the total export of still existing 17+1, are very low. And the Chinese investments, the good investments, foreign direct investment, has not been materialized. So yes, I fully agree that this is not that this is dangerous game to try to hedge the EU other country members with China. and trying to solve the problems within the European Union by using the external leverage. That's not the good game.
Thank you. And then in the meantime, we received one more question from the audience, and this one is a little bit provocative. So please pay attention, and I'm really eager to hear from you. What do you think on this? The question goes: China has not so far fought open wars and/or annexed territories in the region, and it doesn't seem to be planning to do so. So why should it be given the same security alert as Russia? Do we have anyone to take this question?
Well, I mean, in our region, of course, they did not annex anything or had open wars whatsoever. But generally speaking, people used to think about China as a peaceful country that did not had any wars, and for the last 30 years of hiding your potential and waiting for a good moment. Deng Xiaoping, so, quoting that pretty poorly, Deng Xiaoping. It is a country that was fighting many regional wars in their region of the world, with Vietnam, with India on several occasions. And when it comes to annexations, we can discuss what happened in Tibet in the 1950s. But still, I don't think that China is a direct military threat to our region, and at least in the traditional sense. You have, of course, the cyber security aspect, which is deterritorialized. It's not linked to China being in this place or another. It can actually strike as every other country can, basically anywhere in the world. But I think that direct threats coming from China are not as pronounced as the threats that actually come from Russia's cooperation with China. And not talking about China sending their tanks there, but I'm talking about Russia being sure that it will not be attacked by China, and so therefore it can focus on the Western front and the Western side of the Russian Federation. I think it is an element of China's influencing the situation here that is getting even more important. And the other one being, if you look at China-Russia relationship as a working relationship based on on convergence of interests when it comes to pushing the US out of Eurasia, then you'll see that any type of escalation on the South China Sea or East China Sea is a very interesting opportunity for Russia to use here in the region. And on the other way around, if Russia does something there, it's a good moment for China to do to achieve their goals on the other side of Eurasia, with the conclusion being that the West's attention, and especially the US attention, is now diverted towards those two goals. And I think both Moscow and Beijing are pretty aware of that, and I will be concerned in the future about them actually using this mechanism to achieve their goals.
So in your opinion, Jakub, should China be given the same alert or same interest from our side as we give as we pay attention to Russia? Or is Russia still the bigger threat for us?
It's an imminent threat with nuclear missiles targeted at our cities. So I think not the same level of alert, but still I would say we should be alert about what China does here.
Yeah, thanks, Jakub. Anyone else wants to comment on this aspect?
I think we need to watch out for not particularly Chinese or particularly in this context Russian threat, but to Chinese-Russian alliance threat, because it is perfectly clear and perfectly there that in strategically important moments, those two countries do not have a problem aligning each other with each other and talking in the same voice, being it at the United Nations Security Council or otherwise. When we talk about the influence over the countries, speaking in the terms of annexation of the territories, it's kind of a very 19th century talk. Yes, unfortunately, it is still happening. My country is an example for that. Ukraine is an example for that. But it's not the only way and only possibility for losing your sovereignty and losing your freedom. If the country A refuses to speak up at any international forum about the gross violations of human rights in China of a particular minority group, it is already a problem for the sovereignty of that country, because it is under the influence of Chinese Communist Party, blackmailed or otherwise made sure that those minorities do not have allies internationally. The same goes for Taiwan. If a country is not able to speak up for the Taiwan, if we are not opening Taiwanese I don't know, consulates or economic sections or cultural sections or whatever out there in our countries, it is already refusing part of your sovereignty for China. And also, when talking about the territories, I just want to remind to our viewers that there is a case of Tajikistan who was demanded to exchange land for the loans that they could not pay to China. So when it comes to grabbing the territories, we have that case also available right now in front of ourselves at this time. And not like a century ago, but like yesterday that it happened, and it is still happening. So we have a combination of, and cybersecurity was already mentioned, we have a combination of all those 21st century hybrid threats that are out there used by China and manipulated pretty well with our governments whenever it is necessary for their own good.
Thank you. And we still have a couple of minutes left, so I would like to do a quick take on solutions to these problems that we have discussed. I think there was a common theme amongst all of you that we need more independent knowledge about China and more independent information generated about China. And this, of course, deals with the issue of academic dependence on China, which we see as a problem in basically all of our countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So can you maybe evaluate to what extent there is the level of dependence in the academic and think tank sector on Chinese finance? What makes Chinese money for universities attractive? And in the end, how to deal with the problem and ensuring that we have enough independent knowledge generated about China? Anyone wants to start? Lukasz, Tinatin, whoever.
Okay, I can take the burden of answering the question. The point is that it's not only about direct financing, as there are various types of think tanks. There are state-funded think tanks. There are think tanks funded by the academies. But the point is about more finances for the research and for the academics who are not dependent on the Chinese co-financing or on the cooperation with the Chinese institutions. There are two types of threats. There are two types of threats to the academic freedom of speech and to the academic freedom of research. The first one is participating in the research funded by Chinese side and to be obliged to make the research and to do the research within the framework that is provided by the Chinese partners, and this is dangerous. However, another threat is the fear among the researchers that if they are outspoken, if they publicly express point of view, is not consistent with the Chinese policies, with the Chinese needs. I spoke about this several in the beginning I spoke about the several objectives that China wants to achieve. And the three of them also consider the researchers. The first one is the Taiwan issue and the One China policy. The second one is the human rights in China. And the third one is the critics or endorsement of the Chinese political and economic model. So here the solution is that more funds, more independent funds provided by the state institutions and by the NGOs to the researchers that would enable them to do the really independent research without the necessity of asking Chinese side to fund the researchers. The researchers who work on China, they cannot work without the funds. So some of them choose to be silent or choose to follow the Chinese expectations just to have their researches in China done or researches on China topics done.
And that's a big issue that we are, I think, discussing quite a lot these days around Europe, and we still need to deal with it somehow. Of course, this academic dependence and independence is not the only problem that we need to deal with. So what are the other solutions that you see as a possibility to deal with the overall problem of Chinese malign influence? Jan, you've outlined already a couple of those in your initial remarks. So maybe can you offer some more thoughts on this, on how to deal with, for example, with elite capture? Because I think that's featured quite prominently in the Czech experience that we've seen. So can you maybe run us through some practical examples of solutions that will deal with this problem?
Sure, I may have a handful of these practical solutions also in the academia field. But first, just let me clarify my previous remark on the seemingly independent outlet, which was run by the court interpreter of the Czech president, which was in fact the main person responsible for the shift to China or this. This shift towards China. So the issue of disillusion is not like a national initiative or issue, but in fact, it was pressured and led by the main elite from the Czech Social Democrats and the Czech president's figure himself. So it was more of a disillusion on part of certain individuals, which brings me to the elite capture, because this is the issue with a great part of the Czech Social Democratic Party, which was affected by this. I'm afraid not many specific solutions are to this one, because this is a very much issue of transparency and accountability, and the issue of taking care of the domestic sort of mess that you have in the political system. And so to tackle the transparency issue, of course, you have to introduce some kind of transparency scheme, a notification scheme for financial or even non-financial support for political parties, for media, for NGOs, which is provided by third country government-linked entities. So this is necessary. Also, to introduce obligations to disclose information about the nature of such relationships with the state, etc. So these are there are good inspirations in Australia, in the United States. They have these acts on foreign agent registration or on foreign influence transparency. So this can be used as good examples. And if I may, I just outlined very briefly a few ideas on enhancing the resilience in the academia, how to protect our universities and the research. So first, we have to, or the universities should do some audit and review of their existing partnerships with the Chinese counterpart, because oftentimes our domestic universities or universities in general, they don't really know who they deal with on the Chinese side. So good vetting of their partnerships and research institutions, vetting of incoming students. Then to raise awareness of all of these risks, espionage risks in academia, training staff. A person should be established at universities responsible for these particular types of risks. And there should be a platform where people from academia or the responsible persons from academia would meet with state and national security experts and be briefed on the various types of risks. Also, you need to enhance cybersecurity, ideally with the help of the government. And yeah, of course, you need to ensure independent research on China, ideally without the help of Confucius institutes. Many of you have been talking about this issue. So yeah, to boosting the independent research with independent money, state money, and with more reliable partners outside of the People's Republic of China.
Thanks, Jan. And I think actually we are already running out of time, and we are already a little bit over the time. But I think this was quite illuminating discussion to share notes on what's the problem. So before we finally wrap up, maybe if you want to offer any one of you some last remarks in 30 seconds to 1 minute, what is the #1 solutions that we should focus on to deal with the problem of Chinese malign influence? Jakub, can you kick us off?
Well, a very, very quick summary. I would say there's a lot that have been already said about countering this corruptive capital / elite capture with, I think, tailor-made approach that is needed for every country. We can use some common international frameworks, both in the think tanks sector and the international relations sector to counter that. But once again, I would like to bring your attention to the other form of economic influence, which is the economic coercion that China is increasingly skilled at. And I think a dialogue on how to counter that, including like for the EU countries, including on the EU level, there's a talk about the anti-coercion instrument, where ideally, theoretically, you will have a symmetrical reaction on behalf of the EU to any kind of economic pressure that China applies to EU member states. It would be a really nice thing to have. And it would be really nice to involve other like-minded partners in these kinds of mechanisms, because, as I said, the economic weight of China, although it's not that pronounced when it comes to our regional exports, I think it still can be used to threaten regional countries there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jakub. Lukasz, what about you? What's the top priority that we should focus on moving forward?
I think that the first is to give up any illusions about China. This is the first and crucial. Let's start thinking it concerns politicians, business circles, and it's a work of us, of researchers and think tanks. And if we are disillusioned about the prospects the Chinese economy gives, then they have no leverage. And the second, I somewhat agree with Jakub on that, that the cooperation within the European Union on working out the solutions that would protect the interests of the governments, of the economies that belong to the common market is crucial. And this is very difficult. There are frictions. We have different opinions. The European Union is very differentiated. But there is no way to work alone, and there is only the possibility to counter China and its malign influence as EU.
Thank you, Lukasz. And what about you, Tinatin? What's your elevator pitch on this? What do we need to do?
Well, I completely agree with Lukasz. First of all, that will be my #1 point as well. stop fascination with China and stop this whole cheering all the time. That will be like ending up this the idea of a speedy success in a country ruled by a communist party. And number two will be bringing all of us on board, bringing Balkans, Caucasus, Central Asia, MENA region on board when it comes to these issues, because it is not necessarily member countries of the European Union anymore. There is much more leverage used against the countries around the European Union or in partnership with the European Union. So I would say number one priority, obviously, for us will be to be part of this whole big picture when it comes to conditionalities, when it comes to setting up the agendas for future cooperation, when it comes to what is it that we need to watch out for, anti-corruption programs, transparency programs, and so on and so forth. You go with a long list. It should be on a state level, and it should be on a non-state level as well. Only in that case we will be able to achieve more success in this endeavor. Otherwise, I think that China is big enough to deal with all of us separately.
Thank you. And I think with this, we can actually wrap up. We've heard a lot of interesting takes from all of our panelists, a lot of ideas for solutions, how to deal with the issue of Chinese malign economic presence in Central and Eastern Europe. And with this, I bid you farewell. And I would like to also offer thanks to our amazing panelists who are with us today, namely Jakub Jakóbowski, Tinatin Khidasheli, Aleksandra Czekanowska, Jan Pamflet, and Lukáš Sarek. Thanks to all of you for your illuminating insights. And hope we can continue the conversation some other time in another event that like this one that today was hosted by the European Value Center for Security Policy and texti.org.ua organization. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.